Good evening, everyone. I am Jeffrey Cohen. I'm the Dean of Humanities here in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I'd like to welcome you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on thank yous, but there are many thank yous to give, especially to all of the people affiliated with the Dean's Office who've made tonight possible. And I just want to start by calling out one special group that's in attendance, which is our group of Early Start Humanities students. If our Early Start Humanities students wouldn't mind standing for a moment. I just want you to all know that you are the future of what we do. Everything that we do is for you, and we trust that someday you're going to be up here and you're going to be doing amazing things. So thank you for coming tonight. So tonight is the annual Marshall Lecture. It's the 21st Marshall Lecture. It was endowed by Maxine and Jonathan Marshall to fund a yearly lecture on the topics of democracy and humanities, two topics that seem intimate to each other. I think we're especially honored tonight that our speaker in his work brings together both of those themes. I think the Marshalls would be very proud to know that he is carrying on the tradition. I am not going to introduce him. That honor goes to my colleague, Professor Brian Goodman, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Brian.
Hi, everybody. So tonight, it's really my great pleasure to introduce you all to Padilla Peralta, Professor of Classics at Princeton University. And at Princeton, Professor Padilla is also affiliated, it's important to mention, with programs in African American Studies, Latin American Studies, and the University Center for Human Values. And as you'll see, it's no easy task to summarize the work of a scholar as prodigious and visionary as Professor Padilla. And I use that word on purpose, visionary. I'll come back to that, the metaphor of vision, of second sight, at the end of this intro. So Professor Padilla describes himself as, quote, a historian of the Roman Republic and Empire with a keen interest in the longue durée histories and ecologies of Western Afro-Eurasia. But even that barely encompasses the multiple worlds, ideas, and time periods he brings together in his work. Professor Padilla's epic educational journey brought him from Santo Domingo in New York City to Princeton, where he completed his undergraduate degree in classics, then on to the University of Oxford, where I was Danielle's neighbor. Then back to the United States to Stanford University, where he completed his PhD in classics, and then spent a couple of years at Columbia's Society of Fellows plotting how to blow up in the field. Professor Padilla has written or co-edited 5 books and counting. First, he's the author of this book, which I know a lot of people have copies of, which is great. 2015 memoir, Undocumented, a Dominican boy's Odyssey from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League. He's also written the meticulously, intimidatingly researched monograph, Divine Institutions, Religions, and Community in the Middle Roman Republic, published by Princeton University Press in 2020. And his new book, Classicism and Other Phobias, based on his W.E.B. Du Bois lectures at Harvard, will appear from Princeton in July 2025. It's a great title, by the way. Really like it. So as if this weren't enough, Professor Padilla has also co-edited Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation, and Making the Middle Republic, New Approaches to Rome and Italy, 400 to 200 BCE. 2 other projects are under contract, including an account of the tumultuous year 338 BCE and A People's History of Rome. So this is all obviously wildly impressive, but as Professor Padilla clearly understands in his work, a new vision for the classics or the humanities, maybe more broadly, cannot be built on a pile of books alone, no matter how tall that pile is or how brilliant. As an old friend of Danielle's, it's been nothing short of thrilling to witness what he is building with his colleagues across multiple institutions. I'll mention just one project in particular. With Sasha May Eccleston, Danielle has established Racing the Classics, which is now expanding from a conference series into a multi-year fellowship program supported by a Mellon Foundation grant. And I want to emphasize, Danielle asked me to mention, this project has been deeply informed and influenced by the transformative work of Ayanna Thompson and Ruben Espinosa and the whole Race Before Race and ACMRS crew here at ASU. So there is an intimate connection with our institution. So Before I hand things over to Danelle, I did want to share just one anecdote. So for those of you, don't worry. For those of you who brought along your copies of Undocumented, so I first met Danelle in chapter 17 near the end when we were both studying at Worcester College at Oxford. So you have to read at least that far. So I was a lonely Jersey boy subsisting on PB&J sandwiches, warm ale, and secondhand books. And I remember the day I spotted this gregarious dude wearing his trademark Yankees hat across that overly manicured quad. And I realize our dean is a Red Sox fan, but I had to bring that up with the World Series starting on Friday. I kind of hoped you were going to wear a Yankees hat today, but that's okay. So the next time I saw Danelle was in the college dining hall, and he was reciting a kind of Latin benediction. And for our current students, Google Translate hadn't been invented yet, so I had literally no idea what he was saying, no clue. But what struck me was that he was saying these ancient phrases so fluently, so colloquially. And I just, because I was so daydreamed, imagined we were having a conversation about the comparative virtues of Bernie Williams and Robinson Cano. The point is that for Danelle, clearly this was no dead language. So it wasn't until later in the term, after we were friends, that I learned about the full stakes of the gambit that had brought Danelle to Oxford. Because of the immigration status imposed upon Danelle by our own imperial state, he was facing the possibility of a 10-year ban on re-entering the United States if he dared travel to Oxford to continue his education. But as he writes in Undocumented, this is one of my favorite lines, if I didn't have any realistic opportunities in the States, why not just bounce? And, I bring that quote up because I think you kind of have to have that kind of boldness, and dare I say swagger, a word I noticed was on page 1 of your monograph. It takes to transform a field of knowledge. So it's Humanities Week here at ASU. So I want to conclude by offering just one last quote from Danelle's memoir. So this is from his application letter to study at Oxford. Quote, reading the classics was an immensely relieving escape, a way of erecting in my imagination some kind of bulwark against everything that I found so threatening. But I want to emphasize, when you read this memoir, I hope you do, he makes clear studying the humanities was never just an academic choice, nor was it only a personal one. It was a way of re-envisioning the world. Danelle describes how Latin and Greek poetry, quote, have taken root in a kind of secondary consciousness I have of myself, end quote. So my students of English 242, I see some of you in the audience, will recognize this description as a form of what Du Bois calls double consciousness. This sense of two-ness is rarely a comfortable thing, but it is a gift of what Du Bois calls second sight. And so I just want to conclude by thanking Danelle for sharing that gift with us tonight. So please join me in welcoming Professor Danelle Padilla Peralta to ASU.
I want to start by thanking Professor Goodman, Brian, my old neighbor Brian, for a magical introduction. Magical because it inventoried so faithfully, so elegantly, the many things that I've come to prize about the opportunities the humanities have afforded me, but above all, because it underlines how significant friendship has been to my intellectual formation. There is no world for me that can exist without the animating bonds of friendship, and our friendship goes back quite a ways. I am pleased too that no unsavory episodes from our sojourn at Oxford were so much as hinted at in the introduction. I owe a pronounced debt to Dean Cohen for extending the invitation to join you tonight, and to the marshals for making this lecture possible. What I thought I would do, because I only have 15 minutes before I have to subject myself to interrogation at the hands of Professor Espinosa, is that I wanted first to present you a poem that has been very much on my mind recently, and to take you through the poem and its resonances for me, and from there to discuss some of the issues that I saw Undocumented as poised to raise for readerships when I began working on the memoir and when the memoir came out. And finally, I'll say a few words about how I see the work of humanistic narrative interfacing with broader concerns about democracy and about the potential of narrative to engage in discourse around and initiate effective practices against some of the more anti-democratic movements afoot. So this is a poem by Cesar Sanchez Peras, entitled Areito por Todos, Ritual Song for Us All, translated by Rina Espaillat. So Cesar Sanchez Peras, Rina Espaillat, and I all share the status of being diasporic Dominican Americans. And what I find beautiful about this poem is its insistence on a multiplicity of identities as central to this feat of indomitability. What you'll see come out in the poem, which I'll read first in Spanish and then in English translation, is a pronounced emphasis on the capacity by inhabiting multiple identities at once to overcome some of the structural barriers that preclude many of us from accessing the possibilities for renewal, preservation, and in time, self-perpetuation that might be vouchsafed to us if we did truly live in a democracy that made space for every single one of us. So here is the poem. And again, I'll read in Spanish first and then in English translation. Areito por todos. Me sacaron como apache de la llanura y del viento, me arrojaron como inca de la barca del silencio, pero vengo de la sombra del pasado y del futuro. Me sacaron como indio, pero vuelvo como negro. Me sacaron como negro del tambor de la esperanza, me negaron el trapiche para moler mis adentros, me negaron en Yoruba, en Bantú, Carabalí, pero vuelvo en la manigua, cimarrón en blanco y negro. Me sacaron por judío, por latino, por moreno. Me sacaron por hispano, por guloya y por negrero. Me sacaron de las nubes, donde desnudé la lluvia. Me sacaron de los montes, donde desnudé la tierra. Pero vuelvo como indio, pero vuelvo como negro. Pero vuelvo en español, en yoruba, en taíno, regresando por los montes, estrenando un rostro nuevo. Vengo con el mascarón de los que no tienen patria. Me sacaron, pero vuelvo, pero vuelvo. They tossed me away as Apache from the plains and the wind. They tossed me out as Inca from the bark of silence. But I come back from the shadow of past and future. They tossed me aside as Indian, but I return as Black. They tossed me away as Black from the drumbeat of hope. They denied me the sugar mill used to grind my insides. They denied me in Yoruba, in Bantu, and Carabalí, but I've returned to the scrubland as maroon and white and black. They tossed me away as Jew, as Latin, as Moor. They tossed me away as Hispanic, as Kula, as slaver. They tossed me out of the clouds where I denuded the rain. They tossed me out of the hills where I denuded the earth. But I return as Indian, I return as Black. But I return in Spanish, in Yoruba, and in Taíno, trekking back across the mountains, trying on a new face. I come wearing the mask of those who have no country. They tossed me away, but I return, I return. One reason why this poem has been on my mind in recent years is because it dramatizes what is an essential conflict that plays out across much of the work that I've carried out. Between, on the one hand, the effort of state powers acting across space and time to fix identities, to specify identities for specific individuals and communities. And on the other hand, the determination forged in resistance of the same individuals and communities to occupy multiple identities at once, and to resist to the extent possible the coercions of those state powers that might seek to impose on them one clean cut, one isolable identity. This is an emphasis that streaks through Undocumented, the memoir. It's a point of return at multiple junctures in the memoir's recounting of my transformation, of my self-realization. But it is also increasingly central to much of the work that I've carried out as an ancient historian and as a comparatist. For much of the past few years, my attention has specifically gravitated in the direction of thinking about what happens when forms of identity are destroyed. And what particularly goads me into pursuing this line of work is the realization that some of the major state powers that inform, for instance, the historical work that I undertake in the ancient Mediterranean are state powers that asserted themselves very violently by destroying local identities and by seeking to impose specific tailored identities that systematically displaced the multiplicity of selfhoods, of lives, of worldviews that had previously characterized the spaces into which they entered. But beyond this being simply a historian's concern, the question of how states construct, define, and delimit identities remains an ever-present concern in this contemporary moment. And I raise it for you now because of an experience that I discuss in chapter 2 of the memoir that has attained a new salience for me in light of contemporary and unfolding projects of anti-immigrant exclusion and of racialized exploitation. So in chapter 2 of the memoir, I talk about an encounter I had that proved decisive for my eventual decision to pursue the study of the ancient Greek and Roman world. This is an encounter with a book entitled How People Lived in Ancient Greece and Rome, and it occurred when my family was living in the shelter system in New York City. I found this book, I opened it, and I was immediately seized by the sentences that laid out quite resplendently the book's own vision of what the ancients were and what they could mean to us in the contemporary moment in which I encountered this book. Here are the sentences. Western civilization, you know this is going somewhere good, right? Yeah. Was formed from the union of early Greek wisdom, and the highly organized legal minds of early Rome. The Greek belief in a person's ability to use his powers of reason, coupled with Roman faith in military strength, produced a result that has come to us as a legacy or gift from the past. This legacy has grown and blossomed into a smooth, colorful way of life, covering equally the arts and the sciences, the one and the many. Wow. There's a whole lot to unpack there, isn't there? You know, it sounds real good, right? Until you start poking away at it. But I have to be upfront about one thing, which is that at the moment of first encountering these words, there was something charismatic about them. There was something almost seductive about them. And I was 8. I didn't know any better. I was young. And what has only become clear in hindsight, and what came very alive for me as I was working on the memoir, is that the resonance that those words had for me at a particularly charged moment in my childhood years had much to do with the displacement from my view and from my capacity to consciously apprehend of those cultures, and specifically those Afro-Caribbean cultures in which I had been reared and was being reared. So in other words, part of the allure, part of the attraction of entering into the space that came to be defined for me as the study of the ancient Greek and Roman world stemmed from what I would later come to know as a hermeneutic and epistemic deficit. If you look at this chapter in Undocumented, you will find out that I was asking my mom all of these questions about Dominican culture and Dominican history, and that I wanted to know more about Dominican culture and Dominican history. And you will also find out that the resources for this were not readily available to me. There were actually very few books on Dominican culture and Dominican history that I could access, either at the public libraries where my family went at the end of school each day and on weekends, or in the library that this shelter happened to possess. But there were these books on ancient Greece and Rome. And so much of the work in the years since the publication of Undocumented has taken as its abiding concern the question of how to address, how to deal with this epistemic imbalance. Another way of putting things is to think of ancient Greece and Rome as attaining a kind of overrepresentation. And that overrepresentation manifesting as it does in the availability of resources for the study of ancient Greece and Rome, also has material consequences for those cultures that do not receive canonizing exposition in textbooks or other kinds of books. If there is any salutary move on the part of Undocumented to rectifying this, and I confess that on some days I have some my doubts about this memoir that I published in 2015, it is that it seeks to interject a representation of a specific diasporic experience in a publishing landscape and in an Anglo-American discourse that primarily privileges other kinds of experience that are afforded much greater degrees of visibility, representationally, historically, and it should also be stressed institutionally. And that therefore the memoir marks a move in the direction of rectifying this species of epistemic injustice. But this is an incomplete move. And one of the questions that I hope to engage with you all as we turn to Professor Espinosa's queries for me is how to dwell with the incompleteness of the move. So when authors say that they feel like they could rewrite their books, there's sometimes a temptation on the part of those who are listening to authors say that, to take that as an appeal or as a predication of false modesty. But I really do truly wish I could rewrite Undocumented. And I wish I could rewrite it not only or even primarily because I think it didn't work as a memoir. I mean, I have my days of doubt about this, but most of the time I think, you know what, it was okay. But because I feel that part of the journey since its publication has orientated me to a whole new set of questions about how to bring the domain of the personal into the realm of the political. And that in some ways now, partly because of the work I've been doing as an ancient historian, but also partly because of the expressly political commitments I have taken on, I feel much better equipped to tackle some of the issues that Undocumented in its 2015 form could only tackle incompletely. But I also recognize that part of the struggle of realizing one's own vision of the humanities and of coming into community with others who are working to effect a similarly rich vision of the humanities, especially a vision of the humanities in public service, is a reckoning with the forms of incompleteness and incommensurability that are bound to characterize any of the work that we pull off, any of the work that we seek to realize. And it is as I make my peace with that incompleteness that I come to you today as an author very much in search of new answers to some old questions. And I hope you'll humor me as we go through them. So thank you for that. Now we'll turn to the Q&A. Mine's on.
They left mine off deliberately. Thank you, Danielle, for that. And thank you for being here. And thank you all for coming out tonight. So I'm going to start with a kind of weird admission. I went to go see Piece by Piece this last weekend with my kids. It's a new Lego movie. And it was selfish of me because it's actually a biopic of Pharrell Williams and really, really kind of amazing story that he has. But there's a moment in the movie that reminded me of you. And I have to say, I read your book on the way back from DC and found myself laughing out loud on the plane and holding back tears on the plane. And this movie was similar in terms of what it kind of led me through. And there's a moment in there where he's grappling with his ambition and success and what he wants for Pharrell Williams. And he says, you know, I'm seeking that trophy, like a Grammy, right? Everything. And he's like, and I realize like, I'm just like, everything seems to be about that. And there's so many people who are behind me and they want me to succeed. Like they really want me to succeed. And he's like, and I'm finally came to terms and realized that the gift is that they are the trophy, right? They are the ones who wanted me to succeed. And I can't help but think about all of the people that you point to in this book who recognize something special in you at different moments and, you know, wanted you to succeed and really took the time and made the effort. And it was something so poignant. So I want to say up front, I don't want this to sound trite, but thank you for telling your story and thank you for writing this book. It's remarkable. So if you haven't read it, you need to read this as soon as you get home tonight. So I'll start with that. So thank you, Danielle. You pointed at this, and I want to start with your decision to study the classics. And you mentioned this one moment at Princeton. On behalf of Chicanos, I'm sorry for Juanjo. Would be uber Latino, but you mentioned how he's telling your friend Amber that her desire to study French, right, and comparative literature was a white chick move, right, and encouraging her to go in a different direction. And it's at that point that you seem to be grappling with kind of what it means to be a Dominican, a Black man, a Latino who is going into a realm that seems to be associated primarily with white scholars. So I'm hoping you can talk about how navigating, and we'll be honest, an incredibly white field, right, that isn't always hospitable in various ways, right, to other perspectives within an institution that is also kind of moving you in that direction, right? So your decision to, one, focus on the classics, like why the classics, and maybe explore that a bit. But secondly, what you gestured at toward the end of your talk now, right? How that experience, how those experiences have influenced the way that you approach your teaching, the way you approach your research, the way you approach the field.
Well, this is a wonderful point of departure. I have to make an admission, and it's one that will be clear if you jump into the book. I am what my parents would call necio. I am very, very stubborn. And when I was younger, I reacted almost reflexively to being told that I could not do something or that something was inadvisable or that I should not do something. Like, in fact, my oppositional instincts were so strong, I would do the exact opposite. It was like an unfailing habit. To the point that eventually my mom was like, I'm just not gonna say anything, I'll figure it out. And in that encounter with some of my classmates, like the necio habits, like for sure asserted themselves. I was like, I could do this. I mean, Juanjo was saying that I can't do this, or that I shouldn't do this, but I could definitely do it. But here was something that I could not fully process at the time, although I had plenty of evidence to point me in the right direction. I could not fully apprehend how lonely it would be. And so when I say that I already had evidence to that effect, I should start by underlining what my experiences, especially in ancient Greek and Latin classes, had been up to that point. I had been in most of these classes the only melanated individual in the room. And yet, even with that evidence, and at the point of my conversation with Juanjo and others, there had been several years of these experiences. I thought, I got this. It's going to be okay. I've been alone in many other settings before. This is just another one. But I was not fully sensitive to what James Baldwin in another context would refer to as the price of the ticket. I was not quite there. So there were some moments when the costs, the potential costs of that decision began to seem almost unbearable later on. Like I experienced a deep estrangement from the study of the Greeks and Romans when Professor Goodman and I were at Oxford together, because I had a very challenging relationship with one of my supervisors, and I just began to feel that this wasn't going to work out. It wasn't right. It wasn't right for in terms of the wider scope of my sensibilities and orientations to the world and to what my obligations to other people and to my community might be, but it also wasn't right because I felt the vibes were not right. You know, the vibes were most assuredly not immaculate. That I can say. But what did ultimately bring me back around to the idea of this was the prospect of forging and sustaining meaningful friendships with people. And I lucked into some of these. My encounter with Professor Goodman at Oxford was like a paradigm of serendipity. But there were others with whom I began to connect at Oxford and then later on in graduate school and beyond, who exemplified for me what it might mean to carry out this work in ancient studies and to do so responsibly and to do so well. What was less clear to me, even after developing these affirming interactions with folks, was how I would reconcile the kinds of work that I wanted to do or intended to do with my abiding sense of obligation to the people whom I name in the memoirs, having been central to me. And here I'll just stop by referencing a text that is very near and dear to me. And it's a text that for a number of years I taught quite regularly. This is a text from everyone's least favorite Greek philosopher. This is Aristotle. The text in question is Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, which introduces and then develops Aristotle's perspective on friendship. And one of the points that is made in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 8, and reiterated in 9, is that you can't be friends with individuals or entities with whom there is no prospect of reciprocation. So this sounds kind of abstract at first, but I come now to one of the major figures in the memoir in order to make clear why this text became, at a later point in my intellectual formation, personally and intellectually relevant to me. Aristotle talks about parents. And he makes the argument that you cannot be friends with your parents, because you can never fully reciprocate what they have done for you. He also makes an argument about how you can't be friends with the gods. But I mean, that's like less surprising. You know? And when I was teaching this text, it finally hit me like a hammer that I was in this relationship of near total incommensurability and unrealizable or sort of non-reciprocity with my mom. There was like no way I could like reciprocate. And I was at an impasse for what felt like an eternity. And even though I've now gotten sort of out of that impasse, I still think a lot about this. I think about the fact that in some cases my debts are truly unrepayable. And I don't know how to act other than to be sort of good oriented towards those people who have cleared the way for me. But I feel that if there is anything salutary about the work that I've pursued, it's that I have tried to realize to the full an ethical vision of me that others had that I could not fully accept at the time that they were developing it. Still less when they were communicating it to me, but that I somehow feel answerable to, called or interpolated by now. And that has been the driving force in the years since, more than anything else.
So that's amazing. And your mother is such a obviously central figure in your story to the present moment. In thinking about revisiting this, and not that you're necessarily going to, but the other side of that coin, as you're talking about friendship, I mean, what I'm envisioning here is the friends you've made along the way that have helped you, right? But you talk deeply about your experiences in New York and the friends you had there and reconnecting with them as a young adult, right? And going back and recognizing that there are no recent commonalities with them, right? And struggling with that. And I think that sometimes as scholars of color, right, there is this real sense of the loneliness you described, not only coming from your experiences within the field, right, but also from your friends from back where you came from who might not have gone in a particular route, right? What would you say about that, revisiting that? How has that remained as a part of your life? And as you're thinking about the personal too, and you're, wanting to bring that into your classroom, like how much of that figures into the way that you approach, the work that you do?
Yeah, this has been a tough question to fully process and answer for myself because of one of the tensions that Undocumented attempts to bring to the fore, but never fully resolved. So one aspect of Undocumented that I relished while writing the memoir was its commitment to place, to the evocation of place. So if there's one thing I hope we can take away from Undocumented is I really love New York City. Right? I love the fabric of the city. I love like the urban textures of the city. I love all these streets that I used to walk as a kid. But it also mattered to me, the city and all its palimpsestic glory, because my friends and I had forged our connections within these spaces, right? The parks and the polo grounds, the parking lot next to PS 200, like all of these like places, like accumulated meaning. And two things happened that many of you will recognize as just functions of time and change. These places themselves underwent transformation, and my friends and I were scattered to the four winds, right? So eventually they left the city too, these old friends of mine. With some of them I reconnected in Texas. So, you know, I had some friends who were part of the Dominican diaspora that ended up in Texas. And we would talk. It was so strange to be having these joyous recollections about childhood and adolescence in New York City while on the outskirts of Fort Worth. Like it just like something was not right. Like it just seemed different, right? Like
Fort Worth.
I mean, I don't know. And also, like, you know, some of my friends have made some very interesting life choices. And these manifested in, for instance, you know, trying to show me their weapons at odd hour. Hey, we don't have to go there. But like, I mean, we had all changed. But what was more substantial than just like the fact of that change was that our relationships were being sort of despatialized or reterritorialized. And I couldn't like properly apprehend the significance of that on our initial re-encounters. Like later it emerged that yes, it was quite different to be like playing basketball with my friends in like Virginia Beach somewhere, like after one of them had returned from service in the Navy, then it would have been to like play basketball in like the streets of Queens or like Manhattan or whatever. But the salient issue for me was that what anchored us and what had served to underwrite our relationship was a common affinity for a set of experiences, very tightly bound to growing up in this diasporic life in New York City in the 1990s. And this was gone. I mean, like this sort of like became at first distant in memory, but then, and now I come back to like the landscapes of the city itself, then the city itself ceased to be what it was, right? And so we're like living, I think all of us in this sort of double or triple bind of simultaneously having to recalibrate our friendships as, you know, we all grow up and grow apart and sort of develop new interests, new obsessions, in some cases new political orientations. And our common reference is now not even identifiable as such. Like, I mean, some of the neighborhoods where we used to walk as kids and teenagers, like, do not exist. All right, so this has been a source of struggle too, even as we try to develop an awareness of what our relationships might mean to us that seeks to extend past the city. This is a horizon beyond for undocumented, because like if you follow the argument of undocumented, you would vest a great deal of time and energy in the idea that there is something redemptive, as I attempt to show in the epilogue, about recreating one's life in the city itself. Like the city is still marked by these steps. I talk about the fact that I bled on this doorstep, like in Jackson Heights, Queens, right? But in truth, the truth beyond Undocumented's initial composition and final revision, there is no longer that ready facility, that haptic orientation to a city that could sort of pulse with the rhythm of my friends' memories, my memories, and so on. And in that sense, I can't but feel like a great sense of loss. So yeah.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I'm thinking then too about the closing of this book and the looking forward. It's, it's published in 2015. Clearly you're entering the profession relatively fresh, right? It has informed the way that you approach it. So can you share with us, what is your vision for the classics? Like what does Daniel Padilla Peralta want for the classics? I'm a student in your 250 student class. Like, what am I getting?
Where are you getting my 250-person Roman Republic history class? You are getting a sustained treatment of why volcanoes are the most important factor in ancient Mediterranean history. No, you're definitely getting some of that, which like the bid for that class that I'm teaching now is, what was more important to the Roman Republic? The assassination of Julius Caesar and the eruption of Okmok off the coast of Alaska in 43 BCE. And I submit to you all that it is the latter that is more important, for reasons that we can discuss after this. So one of the things I've tried to convey to students in terms of foregrounding, like my own vision of what the study of the ancient world might look like. Note that I did not use classics, as a term. Is that this is a space for them to reflect critically on the time depth of our moral obligations. Right? So, about a year ago, I was asked to write this sort of short piece on the future of classics. I feel like this is like something that happens with like scholars of a certain vintage who are now being asked to write these pieces. I had, at the time, been reading a lot of literature written by long-termists, people who really insist that we have like very serious moral obligations to the unborn, including the unborn who may live like many millennia beyond this current moment. And so we have to engage in these kinds of like utilitarian calculations to figure out what actions we might take now that could benefit the unborn millions or billions and so on. And the reason I was consuming all this literature was partly out of curiosity, but also because I saw it as useful for sorting out a problem I had. So before I continue, I have to say that I do not agree with the long-termists. And I believe that actually our greatest obligations are to those who have died. And that we have this extraordinary and unrealized sense, multitude of obligations, not just to those recently deceased, but those who are more distantly deceased, and that we have especially acute obligations to people whose names are not preserved in high visibility historical records, that if anything, their underrepresentation makes the nature and scope of our obligations to them even more pressing for us to confront. And so I began sort of working on this piece and trying to lay down some foundations for an argument along these lines. And it then hit me that this was it. This was like actually the vision I wanted to present to people. And like some of that vision originated in my own shifting sense of how best to enter into meaningful ethical relation with my own ancestors. Like I was really, really taken at the time with this passage from the opening of Jean Casimir's Haiti, a Decolonial History, in which Casimir starts by saying that he wants to honor his ancestors, and that one of the things that had come home for him in working on this book was that for all their flaws, his ancestors stood out to him as being extraordinary and exemplary people, and that he just wanted to do right by them. That what mattered most to him was to be in ethical relation to them. So prompted by that, I began to think, okay, I too want to honor my ancestors. I also want to think about my ancestors capaciously, because there are many, many people in the distant past who will not have known that one day I would come about, and I would come about because of choices that they made. And I see that network of relation as extending in many different directions across space and time. And so for me, any sort of first move in the direction of justifying the study of ancient cultures begins from a sense of rootedness and obligation. And thinking through what the manifold dimensions of those obligations are has become increasingly central to my scholarship in a number of different contexts: Roman history, Caribbean history, Caribbean receptions of the ancient Greek and Roman world, Afro-diasporic histories more generally. But beneath all of these different research commitments is an abiding attention to the belief that obligations to our ancestors capaciously construed are defining factors in our very real and contemporary social relations and need to be spelled out as such. And that if we fail to articulate them as such, then we run a real risk, not just of losing sight of these obligations, but of engaging in real wrongs against each other, the living, in the current moment.
No, I love that. And it's clear to me just from your work, Danelle, your commitment to social justice, and clear to me in terms of the title of your book, right? The theme of it, Undocumented, which is just in the background throughout. And I have to say, kind of the recurring, attention to living sin papeles, right, is something that's there. I could not help but think of young Danelle and the stressors of that. I mean, as a child and as a student and as a college student, right? And going forward, and you like readily recognize you had some of the most high profile people behind you in trying to make this correct, right? And correct this, including Bill Clinton, right? As you see through Hillary Clinton's advocating on your behalf, and still to no avail, right? That to me is striking because you begin your book with a quote from Jeff Sessions, right? Who suggests that, there's nothing, essentially nothing good comes from Haiti, nothing productive will be here. And I couldn't help but think of something closer to home here in Arizona, a book called The Devil's Highway by Luis Alberto Urea. He talks about the Yuma 14 men and children who died on a passage coming into Arizona, trying to immigrate into Arizona. And how after publishing the first edition of that book, one of the nephews of one of the men who died contacted him and said, "Thank you for writing it because I did not know what happened to my uncle." Turns out he also immigrated through that same route and became a PhD in world economics and is a professor abroad. But it's, he did not wish to be identified. But really kind of breaking the common narrative of the immigrant who does not contribute to society. And clearly you're contributing in a very meaningful way. And I think in terms of a last question, then you talk about obligation, right? And thinking about the past. What do you see as your obligation to your students and specifically to the dreamers? And how has that work been? How has that experience been for you? Because you clearly put yourself out there. I imagine that a lot of people are turning to you in this regard.
Also, I think in order to answer that question, I will direct everyone to another book they should read by Carla Conejo Villavicencio entitled The Undocumented Americans. It's a beautiful book. It combines Conejo Villavicencio's work as a journalist with some of her own experiences as an undocumented immigrant and as the child of undocumented immigrants. But one of the issues that she flags is one that had become prominent for me in the lead up to the implementation of DACA under President Obama, and that remained conspicuous for me in the years after DACA as DACA underwent a series of legal challenges. And it was that the attention to the dreamer narrative had biased the conversation around undocumented folks in the direction of privileging people who checked off certain boxes of achievement that were legible to a broader American public. And whenever I had to confront, as I did in the years before and after the publication of Undocumented, questions from people who might identify or wish to identify themselves as well-meaning, these tended to take the form of insistence that, well, for people like you, there should be a path to legalization. And I was like, no, that's not it. You definitely missed it. You did not get it. You have not done the homework. No, path legalization should be available for all. And there should be no predication of status on this kind of ostensibly meritocratic determination that it actually is a gross moral calculus. I think of all of the people in my communities who never had an opportunity to pursue the kinds of educational resources that I was fortunate to access, and who have done incredible work, who are outstanding. And I think also of the people who have sacrificed so much in order to make my life and the life of those near and dear to me possible and real and attainable. And to me, it seems self-evident that their worth should never be linked to the question of whether they got an Ivy League degree or even like pursued higher education. Like to me, their worth speaks for itself. And correspondingly, our body politic should recognize that worth. But this has been the struggle. And this is a struggle that is already registered in the title of the memoir, as you pointed out. I should say, for folks who are interested in pursuing this line of conversation with me after we wrap up, that I did not like the title. And I fought my publisher over the title. Because the foregrounding of undocumentation is all well and good, but a Dominican boy's Odyssey from a homeless shelter to an Ivy League has that classic meliorist ring to it, right? And I mean, there's like also like a logical fissure in the subtitle because it insinuates that that my journey was akin to an Odyssey. I mean, that much is figured by the use of the word, but B, that I attained some kind of homecoming in the Ivy League, right? Like, like the progression is like, from a homeless shelter to the Ivy League, right? And like, this seemed to me like absurdity on absurdity, right? Like the idea that my homecoming would take place only in the Ivy League seemed to me a profound depreciation of the many formative contexts that had created for me a home. And it made me think that I had a home in the United States somewhere. And so I want to end with that. I want to convey to each of you, as you think about the kinds of work that you might be called to do, that there is much to be gained by moving away from what in another context I would refer to as meliorist implotments, right? Like the struggle to make a home for people does not end with some kind of delivery into some meritocratic paradise where the only people who get to access these opportunities are people who are credentialed in certain ways or look certain ways. The struggle to create home begins right here. It begins right now. And it begins with the choice to value each and every single person in our communities as deserving of full protection. That is the struggle. That is it. Like there is no other struggle that I think is as worthy as that one.
Well, I think I can confidently say that we all hope that this is your actual homecoming. Jeffrey Cohen, I'm looking at you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Danielle, thank you sincerely for being here. And we have a reception directly after, so if you had questions that you wanted to ask Danielle, he is a very generous and kind person. I'm sure he will answer them.
Thank you so much, Ruben. So the reception is directly behind me outside in the courtyard. So please join us there. Bring your questions for Danielle. Please join me in thanking our guest again.